Good evening, everyone. I'm Weslee, and I am one of the ministers of congregational care at Brentwood United Methodist Church. And we are so glad that you have joined us tonight for our latest edition of Resiliency and Hope. And we have designed this time and reserved this space for conversations surrounding mental wellness. And our hope is that you are able to identify some of the things that you might be feeling and experiencing and possibly struggling with. In the midst of all of that struggle, find strategies and strength and hope to carry you through. So that's what we are doing here tonight. And because I am who I am, and because I like to keep us on our toes, I'm going to mix things up a little bit here today. And I'm going to introduce our panelists first. Our three private practice therapists at the Brentwood United Methodist Counseling Center have joined us each month, and this month is no exception. So we have with us tonight Dr. John Fite, who is a counseling psychologist who specializes in individual and couples therapy for adults. He also works with adolescent individuals and does also executive and life coaching as well. And we have Dr. Jim Wellborn, and he is a clinical psychologist who specializes in individual, family, and group psychotherapy with children and adolescents. And we have Stacy Jagger, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist and specializes in restoring the connection between children and their parents. As always, thank you all for being here. It is such a joy to spend this time with y'all. And thanks for always bailing me out too. Nobody wants to listen to me. So we're glad that y'all are here. And I think all of y'all are muted. So if the therapist would like to unmute, then they can hear y'all and not me all the time. Wonderful.
Well, first I want them to hear, what a great job you've done. Okay.
Oh, well,
that you've made this a joy. Thank you.
Well, this
absolutely.
Y'all are the ones that like provide all of this stuff for us to chew on, and it's wonderful. So what I would like to start with is those who are tuning in, there is a box that you can ask the counselors questions. So if you have questions as we're talking, you want to submit those, then we will get to some of those in our question and answer time. So look for that box, go ahead and submit those, and we'll talk about those as well. So this time last year, the world looked a little different. It's kind of funny. I was watching the news as I was making dinner tonight, and even the nightly news, let's see, I wrote it down. U.S. marks 1 year since the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus pandemic. What else did I hear? They're doing a series of pandemic 1 year of COVID. This year marks an anniversary that the entire country and the entire world share, which is different. We all have holidays that each country kind of shares. Okay, we have Christmas and those kind, but this is one that really the entire world shares. A year ago this month, we plunged head first into this global pandemic, and we're still here. Now there's light at the end of the tunnel, but I think so many conversations that I have seen and that I have had and that I've watched on television have included the phrase 1 year ago. Log on to Facebook and you have those memories that pop up, and it's 1 year ago today, and you see a completely different world than where we are now. So I catch myself kind of mindlessly thinking about what this year has been. And I'd kind of like for us to spend some time remembering. I want us to remember what that's been like. I want us to look at the good things that have happened. I want us to remember the struggles. But I also want us to process that. And I trust that God's going to lead this conversation where it needs to go. He kind of knows better what people need to hear than what I do. So I'm going to trust that this conversation goes and is what people need to hear. So tonight I'm asking that God will walk alongside of us as we remember. God knows those who are grieving, who are remembering struggles, and those who have found memories of this last year that are good. Some are anxious, and some are anxious about starting back. Um, there's some ambiguous losses. So my prayer right now is that God's going to come alongside of us wherever anybody is and be what that person needs in our conversation. So here we go. How's y'all's year been? Let's just start there.
Oh boy.
Because that's an open-ended question, isn't it?
Well, I wanted to jump in, Weslee, and just say that I remember this time last year, I had just come back. I was visiting my son in New York City, which at that point I did not know was ground zero in this country. And we went to a place called the Spy Museum. And there was all kinds of exhibits in Manhattan of things that you touch and you put your face up against over and over. And I came home and I got so sick, but it was the type A flu. And the next week after that, unbeknownst to me, my son and his fiance both became sick with COVID. And they didn't tell us on purpose because they didn't want to upset us and just came that close to going to the hospital. And the next week I closed my practice down after, except for remotely, after a doctor in my office who was my client, she looked at me and she said, you know, if anybody coughs in here, you're going to have to ask them to leave. And that was kind of a wake up.
Ooh,
Everybody's got a story. There's lots more.
there are. So when you think about 1 year ago, that's very different than the way it looks now.
Yes.
And that changed your entire practice for the last year.
Absolutely.
For me, it snuck up on me. There wasn't for me, I didn't have a definitive, oh, it started. I mean, they had the times that they started saying we needed to do something about regulating contact and about surfaces and about disinfectants and that level of hand washing and all of that kind of stuff just kind of began to have me have to figure out what I was going to do with my practice, with the initial thought being it would be about regulating that somehow, but continuing on. And also about it didn't strike me that in a, I guess, intellectual way, that this was going to be going on as long as it did. I was really, so what I mean by it snuck up on me is we kind of started into this and I said, oh, we're going to do this and oh, I'm going to have to do that. And we'll be doing virtual for some amount of time. And then it started kind of piling on top of that. And so John was talking about a specific kind of incident for him. And mine was more, it kind of slid into it.
Ours, I think the part that has struck me most has been the fact that I have 3 kids, and my oldest and my youngest have not stepped foot in a school building now in over a year. Now that's our choice. Part of that's our choice. I chose to keep them out virtual for the rest of the year because I could do that. But I mean, that's huge. You know, they got out. We had the tornado. They were out for that. Then they went to they went on spring break and they were gone.
Right, right. I was in anticipation for us getting together and talking tonight. I started writing down all of the things. I tried to begin try and approach a comprehensive list of all of the levels of things that were affected by the pandemic and by the shutdown that came after it, and the other things that went on during this time period. And it's shocking to me. It's, you were that there's like 25 or 30 categories of things that have subcategories within them about the different aspects of life that were directly and significantly impacted and changed in a way that required us to do things like dramatically differently. But while I was doing that, I also found that I struggled some with the positive that comes from this. I don't want to say that I'm negative because I tend not to be as a person, but it was just striking to me that I trying to think, okay, how do you, what do we get? What do we take from that? Not what we take, what positive came from this? This could be, in my mind, it may very well be one of those things where you have to make something positive out of it rather than something inherently positive came from that. I mean, revealing the weaknesses of the United States system for dealing with a pandemic. Okay, well that's kind of a backwards positive like thing, not being able to do the regular kind of taken for granted aspects of daily life requires you to have to kind of reflect on what you're doing. But if your regular, typical, everyday life circumstances were fine, or you enjoyed them, or they were, as it were, good enough, thinking about doing that differently again is kind of a backwards. That was kind of the struggle that I found myself in trying to think about this as an anniversary. Anniversaries of events, single events, has more coherence or something to it. But this was really slippery for me.
Yeah, it's kind of an ongoing anniversary.
Well, yes, and it's not over either. I mean, we've just got an arbitrary kind of designation that it was the time a year ago when it really clearly began to be addressed. So.
Yeah. As Casey and I were talking about this, which we were talking about it in terms of the way that we look at memorials. And the way we do memorial services. And she talked about how, because there is so much stuff here, she was kind of helping me narrow it down, because we could go on for days about all of this stuff. And she talked about how we do three things in memorial services. And we look at the past to honor the beauty and the tragedy of a life and of loss. And then we look at the present to acknowledge the grief and the complex web of emotions. And then we look to the future for hope. As we are, if we start by looking backwards, why is it important for us to remember? Are there health benefits? What is it about remembering that's important?
Well, are you talking about remembering in the instance of a loss or something that's associated with grief? Or are you talking about just in general?
I think in this case, we'll talk about loss, and we'll talk about remembering the last year, I guess. Right. Why would it be important to on this day look back over the last year? I mean, the television shows are doing it.
Right. The magazine articles, everybody's right. It's
right. Facebook, everybody is 1 year ago. Why is there? Let's just start with that. Is there something important?
I think yes, but the confusion in my mind about trying to figure out that with regard to the pandemic and the shutdown that's occurred with that is that it's not over with. And so it's more an acknowledgement of what all has happened It's more of a appreciation for the impact that it's had. From a general perspective, about things where you are experiencing loss when there's a dramatic shift or change that's required of you, that's imposed or even generated by yourself. If you're interested and committed to trying to make changes in your life, the value of looking back tends to be kind of maybe self-evidently about what lessons can you learn from that. What are the things that you can take from that? Because by definition, it's not anything that you can change. You can change how you think about it. You can change whether you want to remember it or not, but it doesn't change that things occurred. And so it's a aspect to me in part about what can you get from that, what kind of realization, what kind of things to inform you about how you want to move forward. Now, that's different to me from grieving the loss of something or someone, which can have a piece of that, but it's really, that's more of a process of dealing with the emotional impact of that, as opposed to making sense out of something.
I think you answered the question that I wished I had asked.
What was that? Because I feel like I'm rambling.
This can be like Jeopardy. You give me the answer, I'll give you the question.
What is how to deal with the pandemic that it's happened in a year and we don't know what to do about it? So.
John, you look like you're thinking on something over there.
Oh yeah, I was actually going to toss it over to Stacy because Stacy, how do you think children will remember this?
I was trying to be quiet. You know, the reality is every child is different. Every child that I see perceives this differently based on how their family is doing. And, you know, when I watch a little kiddo come into my office with a mask on and they just act like it ain't no big deal, it's like wearing underwear now. I mean, I'm amazed at how they're not fighting it. You know, they're just, there's a sense of acceptance, I think, with a lot of kids that this is just what it is, you know. And I'm having a hard time remembering being 6 years old, but I think that if I were 6, I would probably be similar, you know, like this is just what we've got to do right now. As far as the grief thing, what was coming up for me is my father was a lifetime alcoholic and died 9 years ago. And I was evicted from every home I lived in as a child, which was about 15 or 16 different places by the time I left home at 17. And I have thought about this last year about how, for whatever reason, it has not knocked me off my rocker. And I've asked myself, why has this not knocked me completely off my rocker? And I think that it's a testament to adversity in childhood, because if you are able to grow through something very difficult in your formative years, when really hard things happen when you're an adult, for whatever reason, there is a different kind of resiliency and strength about you that, and it's hard to give that away. It's a way that I've been able to be thankful for how I was raised, although I would not do it twice, just so you know. I would not do that twice. But because I cannot go back, I am grateful.
That's what I'm talking about right there.
I cannot go back. That is what I've been able to take from it, is a real sense of gratitude that for whatever reason, I've been able to take that experience and make something of it. And for the last year, I think every day of my life since a year ago, my husband and I've just looked at each other and fist bumped and said, how are we going to get through the day? You know, we have 4 children. Let's get as creative as we can. And and take this back to 1979. What I also like about it is everybody's a hot mess. Before this happened, I don't know, 20% of people wanted to admit that they were a hot mess, and now 100% of people are completely fine with admitting that they're a hot mess. And that has been kind of comforting for me because I've always been a hot mess.
We're all joining the same team.
I'm just like, I'm feeling very at home. Anyways, my humor keeps me alive, and I think having a sense of humor is really important. And so I don't know if I answered any question you had, but was my 3.5 minutes of words.
No, this is one of the things I love about this, because we can throw out the question. We can throw out the question and we just talk. It's great.
Well, it certainly brings up what Stacy's talking about is the issue of what is it that is stressful and how do you define what is stressful? And the researchers have a bear of a time coming up with this for exactly what Stacy was talking about, which is different people have different skill sets and different resiliency levels. And that means that some people are affected very readily by one thing that other people, it doesn't really affect them at all. When you get to the extremes, then is where you start finding the more universal. So everyone who has this kind of thing happen to them, a catastrophic event of any level, the death of somebody who was emotionally very close to them, not just a family, it's not generally defined as a family member, but it's about the relationship with the person who dies. There are major environmental catastrophes, that war, those things, then there's a universality to the level of stress that's experienced by that. But even in those cases, what's clear in the research with people who study this in the small and in these larger areas is that there are qualities that people have that have them be able to survive those things better, to cope with them and be able to move forward and first just survive it, but also then potentially thrive with it. And some of those, Stacy identified directly that she had some personal experience with, but also that's just true for people. And so that the issue about everybody being affected by this, I think is a significant element of this experience and this occurrence of this event that's unusual. It's like a world war. It's like early on, I found myself thinking and actually using as a model in talking with parents about World War II when the entire country had to gather metal to be able to make the machinery and armaments and that kind of business. And there was a unified feeling that we're all in this together, that kind of business. This was at that same level. Now, the problem for me is that we didn't quite get to that all for one and one for all kind of thing, which was problematic about that. But the scope of this was that it wasn't so clear. You could be clear about going to war. You could not be so clear about what was happening, even though it was the global in its effect.
One thing I would add, Weslee, to this was that, tagging on what Jim said, that, when you think about ambiguous loss, loss where it's uncertain exactly the magnitude of the loss, which we're at a point now where hopefully it's a lot less ambiguous than it was at the start. But at the start, we didn't know how this was going to go, what was going to be wiped out, what was going to be left. And in those kind of circumstances, it's really important that we be able to normalize how ambiguous the loss is, that no one really quite knows. I always used an example of an ambiguous loss as a client I had years ago whose child had been kidnapped. And she didn't know where that child was and if she was going to see that child, and just horrific pain. And that confusion was that rolling confusion was a lot of what we had in the beginning of this. And what we need in that kind of situation is to be able to normalize that, hey, nobody knows what's going on here exactly, and to try to have this atmosphere where we can talk about it and learn from each other. But instead, that's not what we had in the last year. And I think that's one of the greatest lessons of this last year to me, is that we really need that all for one, one for all. Let's figure this out together kind of mentality.
Kind of a band together and get it done. Yeah. You're talking about ambiguous loss. That was actually, I attended a online seminar on grief and the Enneagram a couple weeks ago. And one of the books that she talked about, and I think you sent this resource, is actually ambiguous loss. Look at here, I'm reading. And it's really good on, you know, explaining some of those things, kind of putting your finger on, oh, so that's where that fits. That makes a little more sense, that it kind of, I didn't know where it fit and it just didn't fit right, but I didn't know where to put it. That's one thing that we've kind of been talking a lot about. And, you know, when somebody passes away, and this might be talking a little bit more about, you know, yes, there is this global thing, but not everybody's on the same page. When somebody passes away, it's like, okay, everybody's on the same page. This person passed away. We're all missing this person. But we deal with it in some different ways. But in this case, it is kind of this, are we shutting everything down? Are we not? Are we, you know, it's that fluid kind of what are we doing? And how are we going to react to these things? And then I think one of the things that I've been looking at is some people are experiencing a whole lot of grief and a whole lot of loss and a whole, like when they look back over the last year, they see sorrow after grief after loss, and that's what their last year has been. And then you have other people who for the last year they have found things. Like I was running with my friend the other day and she said, I'm not ready for things to open back up really. I kind of liked the fact that everything, we were at home, I got to know my kids. So you've got these two, this one is so much grief and so much sorrow, and this one over here is, I really enjoyed this. How do you do, like, marry those things in the same area, I guess, or answer a different question?
Well, the thing that I've found myself reacting to is when you're saying that your friend really treasured this way of being and was enjoying that and found it to be helpful and meaningful to her, I guess. And I have to say that the first thing I thought about is that the great likelihood is, was it a she or a he? Who is your friend? I'll do that. I'll do the plural pronoun. My assumption actually is that they have the financial resources to be able to weather this. There's distinctions that are made about how people have made it through this, that while there's been universal disruption of things, the core disruption of your income and your livelihood and your ability to provide for yourself and or your family in terms of paying for rent and having food, and that was catastrophic. And that if you have a conversation with somebody who's been through the pandemic, who's had the effect of all of the restriction of businesses and the limitations of employment, then it has at times catastrophic complications that go along with that. And so that's the other thing that's on my mind for myself, is that there were aspects financially for me and my family that wasn't a central issue. It had an impact, but it didn't destroy our ability to feed ourselves and to have our living spaces and that kind of thing. And so that one of the things that can be a problem in discussions about what's going on with the pandemic is the degree to which the people or the person who's discussing it is talking from the perspective of this disrupted a lot of things, but my core kind of foundation for stability of life remained, as opposed to the people, the people who remain the same. The people who it disrupted was huge and is ongoing. And so that was the piece that makes this so difficult for me about how devastating and how impactful this has been, because that takes winding back up. So if you don't have resources, financial especially, you've run out of past what you already had very quickly. And then even when things start picking up, you've got to ramp back up, all of which extends the time that all of this is happening and creates differences in the experience of this too.
So an inconvenience on my part, which is, when
Of
we
the
look
sort,
at
yes. No, and I don't want to minimize that it was dramatic for all of us. It was dramatic for me. It just wasn't financially catastrophic.
right,
And that level bumps it to a whole other level.
right.
As I think about it.
Well, and I think, it, like I said before, I have been able to choose to keep my kids home because I can work from home. I mean, I was fortunate enough to do that. I changed jobs, but I didn't lose my job.
Yeah.
My changing of jobs made it possible for me to be at home with my kids while they're virtually learning.
Yeah.
And I think this actually does bring up another one of my questions is you do have, you do have somebody in my position where it has been an inconvenience and it has been a struggle, but I can minimize real quick. I can go, oh, that's an inconvenience. And yes, this was hard, but it wasn't hard like it was hard for these people. And
Right.
so there's that balance, I think, of recognizing there are differences. And maybe this is something that you all can speak to too, is how do you balance those things? Because how do you recognize the weight and the difference of the two experiences and give importance to both, to give voice to both? Because I'll real quickly go, you're right. I mean, that's what
Are you talking about the situation where who's had the worst life experience? And so if you've had a difficult time, but somebody else has had a much more difficult time, I like to think, the way I think about it, if you're a naturally good person, which means I had to develop this, but if you're a naturally good person, you think, well, that means that I don't really have a right to feel bad about this. It can be you can even have guilt about thinking that why am I complaining about this when somebody's got it worse?
Mhm.
That struggle certainly would be relevant here, but it's often a struggle, especially with people who are having different kind of psychological or emotional or relational issues that come into our office. And some of the times they've waited a long enough time because they're thinking, I don't have it as bad as other people I know of, or it wasn't that bad, that kind of concept. And so this notion about having to be able to acknowledge and recognize that things can be meaningful and impactful on you, even though relatively other people may have more difficult struggles, that doesn't mitigate the fact that it's still a meaningful and impactful thing to you that is worth attention and worth trying to figure out how to improve or feel better about or resolve or those kinds of things.
I think life is, it's bitter and it's sweet. And it was bitter and sweet before this, and it's bitter and sweet now. And acknowledging both, that it's bitter and it's sweet, and acknowledging the bitter and acknowledging the sweet. And, even teaching children that life is a combination of both every single day. And this pandemic has just magnified that reality. Is important, to simplify things for, especially for children that are spinning around going, what in the world's going on around here? Just helping them understand that this is normal, that life is bitter and sweet. And this has just magnified that truth.
Weslee, one thing I wanted to add is that, we're all, particularly in this year, I think much more aware of the privilege that people have, because this pandemic has laid bare a lot of inequity, in our society. But looking at it through the lens of mental health, what matters the most to me when I'm talking to someone is that sense of hopelessness, because that's really what's dangerous, and people at all levels of society or can be prone to that. And that's something that puts them at very risk, for hurting themselves. And one of the groups that I've, tried to reach out to in this year, I've run a support group this year for my single clients, because they were really having a tough time, along those lines, with just their perception that they didn't have anyone, many of them, to go home to or to hang out with. And they were faced with some pretty stark choices. And by kind of having, kind of a virtual support group, we were able to get through. And part of that included something new for me as a therapist, is to deal with someone who's actually sick. They're sick. In the old days, I wouldn't see them, hopefully, but now I'm actually seeing them through virtual therapy sessions with the diagnosis of COVID, and following them through with that fear. And that's added in some ways kind of a good dimension to what therapy can do for people.
I have noticed that the children that I'm working with are a little dysthymic. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, here's baseline, and they're just like a little underneath it. And they're also having a difficult time celebrating. Almost like, what does it matter? I'm just seeing a lot of that in my office with children. And I've even had some younger adolescents say things like, I just wish I was born in a different time, a different era. So I think there's a real, I'm not sure what the word I'm thinking of is, there is a hopelessness, John. There's a little bit of that going on. And certainly I'm not trying to have toxic positivity around it. But I think helping families understand that life has always been bitter and sweet, and trying to figure out how to navigate all that has been helpful. So,
well, and there's a question also about how much the disruption of typical daily life is contributing to this. There have been a few folks. It's really hard to collect reliable data and analyze it quickly. And so when they have national data sets about that, they question people about certain kinds of attitudes or values or perspectives or the aspects of their lives, it usually takes a year or two for those data sets to be begun to be analyzed and presented. But there have been a couple that have jumped really quickly and concentrated their efforts on this. And one that I came across that was stunning to me was talking about kids from, it had the whole lifespan, but of course for me, it's like kids from 11 to 18, and then that 18 to 24. So that range of things. And in that range of things, this particular research program had screening devices that were online, and they had like 1.5 million participants in this. It's huge data set. And what they found is that for teenagers and for young adults, there was a slight decrease, lessening of that in young adults, but in the same range. 80% of those respondents endorsed a level of anxiety that was clinically significant. And 70 to 80% endorsed a level of depression that was clinically significant. That's breathtaking. That is breathtaking. And Stacy, it speaks to what you were talking about, because my own experience that parallels that is that I can, many of the clients that I had going into the pandemic. And so I could see a difference. It's exactly what you're talking about, Stacy, where they weren't saying, I'm really this, I'm really that. But it was there. The weight of this, the kind of a sense of oppression that they were just but moving forward with and not necessarily acknowledging. I'm wondering about, first, how much of that is going to be flipped when they get back into school, because the other thing that has been showing up is that the two primary stressors that everybody is indicating, always at the top of the list, is social isolation and loneliness. That's what's driving a significant part of what's driving the mood problems, the anxiety and the depression. And so the nice thing about that is that when the pandemic shutdown starts flipping back, people get to interact, people have access to that. And we've got the transition stuff, but that also speaks to what if this is going to stay versus what if this is going to be healed by the changes of that. And what we're likely to see, which is what we typically see, is that the more vulnerable people, the people who went into this already anxious, who went into this already depressed, who went into this already suicidal, that those folks are going to have a longer term effect of this, even when things start to shift back, because it has the potential of having kind of dug that in even more. So we've just got different kind of trajectories that are likely to come from this also. You know, I was looking at, there's somebody, I think there was somebody in the chat who had a question. What do you recommend to help heal relationships that have been hurt or almost severed during this time of social distance and political stuff in COVID? And what that made me think about is for me, I immediately thought about, I was making that list of all the things that this disrupted or affected or caused problems with. And one of those is that we all had to be in the house constantly with each other. And for teenagers, that's a disaster because their developmental task is to be more connected to their peers. And so they're disconnected from that. But it's also the case that we can get along perfectly fine and have healthy relationships as long as we get a break from each other that has used to happen naturally when you come and go, or you have work, or the things. But we've got this concentration of limitations of being able to get out and socialize. And here's a person who's asking about the more significant impact of that, where it's actually started to create more serious conflict or friction and affecting their relationship.
So in answering that question, is it providing?
I didn't answer the question. I just stopped because it was an adult and I was waiting for John to answer the question. Okay.
All right. I'll answer the question. Same answer. I didn't have an answer to this question last year, or it would have been more complex. Now, what I'll say is I have a resource. So if somebody's family has been damaged by the political COVID, meaning the politicization of the pandemic and all of the difficulties that we've been there too from that, I recommend a group called Braver Angels, where for free, you can go get some training on how to talk to the people in your family around these subjects. And it's very good training. I participated in it. And briefly summarizing, they encourage you to do these 4 steps. Listen to the other person, acknowledge what they're saying, okay, and then pivot, which is the point where you signal you'd like to share your point of view. And if it's agreed, share your point of view, okay? So there's some 4 steps that you can take to kind of do that. And then don't be surprised if the other person doesn't want to hear your point of view initially. Do not be surprised about that. Don't feel compelled. If it's a relationship, you're trying to gain ground over the long run rather than trying to hit a home run. You know, you've got to be realistic about that. But relationships obviously can be repaired. Every one of us has been in a relationship that's been subject to some overhaul from time to time. And so it's worth doing most of the time.
You know, Weslee, the other thing that comes to my mind about this, and it's related to, I guess, part of what I was thinking about when I was, what came to my mind initially, is that, but it's also related to what you were talking about earlier, which is recognizing the impact that this has. Some of this stuff is so subtle because it's a fundamental change in stuff that we never questioned or aware of that was so important. So you're very unlikely to have thought, you know, it's really important that both of us go to work during the day so that we can come back and have special time with each other rather than just be annoyed by our little irritating habits. Okay. And there's a general part about that as you evolve in a relationship, having to deal with what sometimes were endearing qualities when you first met somebody and then become annoying and frustrating later. But the idea is, in my mind about that, is that if you recognize that there's an inordinate pressure put on the relationship that wasn't there before, you can overinterpret the problem. So you could say, oh, there must be a fundamental problem in our relationship, as opposed to, we need to make sure we take a break from each other and then see if we still have those problems. Because with that break, you also gripe to your friends about stuff, you talk to your therapist about stuff, you get a chance to breathe and relax, and then you come back and address the very thing that was annoying, but you didn't have to stay focused on it because you were stuck in the same house day after day after day without any relief from that. So it's not necessarily an indication, and that's related to what John was saying, that it's a form of an indication of the serious problem in the relationship. It's a serious issue to be addressed and to be attended to, and see what can help with that. And then you'll also find out, there's some deeper rooted underlying things, because in the same way that time apart can help when you need to just kind of chill and come back together, that time together can show, wait a minute, I didn't really realize this was going on because we were spending time apart. And so the problem is it can go in any direction, but it's not always a sign of it being a problematic thing about the relationship, other than something that needs some attention and needs some kindness and needs some consideration from each other and communication. It's always starts at the bottom of communication.
I tell families a lot to put the bond before the behavior. And if they can separate the bond from the disagreement and focus on the bond first before they focus on the behavior, then many times the disagreement starts to not be as big of a deal. And so in repairing relationships, especially with parents and children, regardless of the child's age, I have found that putting the bond first is real helpful.
Yeah.
And I work a lot with couples, and there have been some couples who have thrived, you know, during the pandemic, who've discovered lots of new things about each other. And
Oh, who is the one, John? I hate those people. They're always want to say, oh, I'm doing everything right. My relationship's wonderful. And I'm like trying to not scream and holler with my spouse about stuff.
Well, we do tend to rely on our spouses more for more things, yes.
Well, to turn that question around, how about this one? How can we boost our social confidence as we try to reconnect in person? So that kind of switches the gear and the direction on that.
I think that this is a lesson in good boundaries. You know, like we've swung it way over here. And for those of us that didn't have great boundaries before, and we were enmeshed with people and, you know, never said no to anything, this is an opportunity where it's really okay to say no to what you don't want to do and not be with the people you don't want to be with. And be a little choosier and pickier with what you want to do with your time. That's my 2 cents. I interrupted you, John. Go ahead.
That's okay. No. That's
No,
important,
yeah.
I guess I was thinking a lot about some of the single young guys I work with, and they're always, worried about something as simple as an awkward pause in a conversation. And, this points to this whole thing of it's important to be accepting and forgiving of yourself. It's normal, just like your fitness might lay off, it might shrink if you don't go to the gym. Your social fitness, your confidence might shrink a little bit if you're in a pandemic. Okay, you're not around people. So being forgiving of yourself is something that's really so important at this stage, and always go from your strengths and your motivations. That's the way to stretch yourself, and do it a little bit at a time and build yourself back up. And just, veering off just a little bit, one of the things I really think a lot about is people being forgiving to themselves about their grief during this period. So many deaths have happened without people being able to have closure, the kind of goodbyes that we've had in the past. And guilt is such a thing that it interferes with healthy grieving. And so it's so important that we all kind of forgive ourselves in this kind of going through this unprecedented experience.
There's a chat person that showed up. Weslee, did you see that?
About the soccer?
Yeah.
Yes. We got a chat here that says, I had a friend who said she was at her kid's soccer game and said she literally forgot how to have small talk.
Because small talk sucks, okay? It's like, it's making up. It's like,
Maybe it's not necessary anymore.
exactly, that's what I'm saying. It's like, there's what
Let's
you're talking about,
just skip that.
Stacy. It's like, okay, that's a boundary. I'm not going to make
Boundary. No more small
superficial.
talk.
I would say, hey, who do you know that died during the COVID? Okay, that's my small talk now. It's like, how much weight did you gain during this? I see we're all wearing our sweatpants today because that's all we've got left. Okay, that's the kind of talk I'm going to be having if I even show up, because I'm so ashamed.
Well, and we had a funeral yesterday. Oh golly, I can't keep up with my days.
Bring a funeral and we're laughing and joking, and now you're.
I know. The weird thing was actually seeing people together, and this kind of brings up this, because we have been, the funerals that we've had, they've been very structured. You didn't have a visitation. You came in, you did your thing, and as a minister, I was like saying, I'm really sorry, but y'all have to leave right as it was over. I mean, it was awful.
Exactly.
Yes, I'm like, I'm sorry, you just can't stay in the church. And a lot of it just feels so awful. But we had one yesterday.
That's a dramatically more significant instance of what we were seeing all the time with folks confronting people who were frontline workers and service workers, and people confronting them about the masks itself. That kind of conflict and that kind of difficulty, both recognizing but also sometimes respecting that those things needed to happen. It's just a part of the conflict that got generated from all this time.
It was hard, but I will tell you, yesterday when we had this funeral, and we've kind of relaxed a few of our things so that we're not having to take attendance, and we're not having to, we don't have as many restrictions now. It felt weird. Like, I'm not really usually an anxious person, but I was like, I feel like I need to go seat these people in their seats that are assigned to them, and they're milling around, and we need to. I've also never done this outside of COVID, so that was the only reference point that I had, and it is a change, and it's a welcomed one. But you do have to relearn those social. How do we do this? So there's a lot of stuff that we're all navigating.
Right.
All right, we got 5 minutes. There's something that I would like for us to talk a little bit about, and John, you brought it up at the very beginning, partly because I think where I started with this, and when I sent you all the, hey, here's what I'm thinking, it really centered around our stories. Each one of us has a story. When we look back over the last year, my my 2020 story looks different than John's does, and looks different than anybody else's does. But I think that's such an important thing for us to be able to do, is to tell our story. I think that helps people realize that they're not in this by themselves, because we all do have that story. Um, I had a friend who sent me a devotional the Monday after Ash Wednesday, and we are in the season of Lent. So I'm going to take a few minutes just to kind of read some of this devotional, because it really meant a lot to me. And it kind of put words to some of these feelings. I'm going to not try to read all of it because it's kind of wordy, but I'm going to read some of it. And it starts off with the verse, Jeremiah 32. It says, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, write in a book all the words that I have spoken to you." And the devotional goes on to say, this passage from Jeremiah reminds me how short our memories can be. Jeremiah speaks to the people on behalf of the Lord in a time of upheaval. But before giving Jeremiah the message, God tells the prophet, write this down. Surely the people would not forget these powerful words of hope coming to them at such a time of grief, fear, and pain. Yet in peace and prosperity, we can quickly forget the trials of the past. This forgetting is dangerous, however, because it allows us to think that we're self-sufficient and in control of our lives. Sometimes, even in despair and suffering, we can forget as well, forget the hope and the assurance from God that our present situation is not the end. The season of Lent comes each year as a time to help us remember. We reflect on our God who in Christ knows what it is to suffer and meets us in our suffering to offer us hope. I thought that was really powerful, because sometimes we need to remember the good, and sometimes, Stacy, kind of what you were talking about, it's both and. And if we get stuck on one side, Casey and I were talking about this yesterday, if you get stuck focusing on all the negative, you miss out on the positive things. And if you're Pollyanna, living in the Pollyanna world thinking everything's fine and dandy, you're missing out on this too. And somewhere in this conversation, she was talking about how it was kind of like a Y. You have this over here and this over here. And in the middle of a conversation, somebody put, and God's right in the center of all of that. He's in the center of this one, and it's in the middle of all of that. I would encourage people, and y'all might have other things here too, but I would encourage people to write your story. Write the story that has the good, it has the bad, it has the light, it has the dark. Write your 2020 story. If you need prompts, let me know. I'll help you with that. Let them know. They'll help you with that. I would like to also encourage people that where you have been submitting your questions, submit part of your story. What have you found that has been the greatest joy? And what have you found that has been the biggest sorrow? I think the more we talk about our stories, the more, Stacy, as you were talking about, we're all a hot mess. And I think the more we talk about that, the more we're human, and the more places we have to be able to reach people where they are. And we can find that hopelessness that y'all have been seeing, and the apathy and the despair. And we can also pull up on the joy, and we can find that resilience, and we find that hope. What other things do y'all have here in the next minute, because I took up those 4.
It seemed like it summed it up to me. Weslee, I think that was a nice convergence of the things that we've been talking about today, for sure.
I just want to get a pedicure.
It's the simple things.
I need one bad. It's been a good year.
And I want a decent meal. Okay. Food is what I'm missing. That's my story.
And have a sense of humor. Oh, all right. Well, thank y'all for being here again. We'll do this again next month because, well, we're all in the
What else have we got to do?
And we'll do it again because it's a never-ending story.
That's
There you go. There you go. Love it.
But really, I would love to have y'all stories. So if y'all want to write the stories too, y'all come on. We're hoping to do some kind of neat things with that in the upcoming future, but we'd love to have your stories. So go ahead and submit those in that box down there, and we'll see y'all next month. I almost said year.
Hi, everybody.
Next month. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thank you.